His hand didn't touch me, yet the command in his voice stripped away every layer I'd hidden beneath. The ballroom fell silent as death itself. My stepmother's face drained of color. The veil trembled between his fingers in my shame. "I want to see the face of the one who dares to carry silence among so much noise," he said. And I knew my life was about to shatter into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Before we dive into this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're watching from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The first memory that cuts through me like a blade isn't one of tenderness, but of the sharp laughter of the woman who should have been a maternal shadow and was instead the executioner of my days. I grew up hearing that my face was a disgrace, a living scar upon the house that sheltered me unwillingly. "Hide yourself," she would say, with that look that permitted no argument. And so I learned to keep to the crevices. Behind the heavy curtains of the great hall, in the frozen corridors where the wood creaked beneath my fragile feet, in the depths of the mist-covered gardens. My presence was considered a curse, and with every breath I carried on my shoulders the weight of not belonging. I don't remember my mother's face. I was too young when she left this world, leaving me in the care of a man who remarried within months, seeking comfort in the arms of a woman whose beauty was matched only by her cruelty. My father, weak and distant, became a ghost in his own home, choosing silence over protection. When he looked at me, if he ever did, I saw only the reflection of his guilt and cowardice. So I became invisible, a shadow moving through rooms where laughter and light were reserved for others. The house where I lived wasn't made of tenderness. It was a monument to vanity, with its gilded mirrors and polished marble floors that always reflected back an image I didn't dare confront. My stepmother, queen of pride and malice, ruled with fists that appeared soft to society's eyes but were iron within the family's hidden chambers. Her pleasure was reminding me that I would never have a place in the ballrooms, that my presence was an affront, that my blood was a stain. Her daughters, beautiful as stained glass, repeated the insults like hymns. With each laugh, with each comment insinuated in public, my invisibility was confirmed. On the nights when wind invaded the poorly sealed windows, I would retreat to a corner of my cold room, embracing the small locket that remained from my mother. Inside, a faded lock of hair was all that connected me to what I was before cruelty defined me. I would press it against my chest and imagine what it would have been like if someone had seen me without contempt. If a single gaze had told me, "You exist, and that is enough." But the walls around me spoke a different language. They whispered that I was unwanted, that my face carried some terrible defect that justified my exile from normal life. I never knew what exactly was wrong with me. My stepmother never specified, never showed me a mirror without snatching it away immediately, never allowed me to understand whether the monstrosity was real or simply a convenient lie to keep me locked away. Perhaps that was the cruelest part, not knowing whether I was truly hideous or merely inconvenient. The servants pitied me in silence. I could see it in their averted eyes, in the way they left extra bread by my door, in the gentle touch when they adjusted my veil before I was forced to appear at family gatherings. But pity, I learned, is just another form of isolation. It builds walls as high as hatred does, keeping you separate, keeping you other. There was one servant, an elderly woman named Martha, who'd been with the household since before my mother's death. Sometimes late at night when everyone else slept, she would slip into my room with warm milk and honey. She never said much, but once, as she tucked a blanket around my shoulders, she whispered, "Your mother was the kindest soul I ever knew. You have her heart, child. Don't let them take that from you." I clung to those words on the darkest nights, when the loneliness felt like it would swallow me whole. Martha died the winter I turned 16, and with her went the last person who'd known my mother, who could tell me stories of the woman I'd never remember. My stepmother didn't even allow me to attend the funeral. "Servants' affairs are beneath you," she'd said with a sneer. Though we both knew the real reason, she couldn't risk me finding comfort anywhere, even in grief. When the candles of the great hall were lit, I already knew I couldn't be seen. I would stay in the shadows where the golden glow couldn't reach, listening to the murmur of ladies who danced as if the world were made of silk and perfume. It was always them, the beautiful ones, the perfect ones, who paraded under the court's eager gaze. I, by contrast, was an uncomfortable secret. My face hidden beneath thin veils fed the cruelest gossip. They said my skin carried stains, that my mouth was crooked, that my eyes were like those of a wounded animal. I never denied it, never confirmed it. Silence was the only dignity I had left. My stepsisters, Eleanor and Vivienne, were the jewels my stepmother polished obsessively. Eleanor, the eldest, had hair like spun gold and a laugh that could charm anyone who didn't know the venom behind it. Vivienne, younger by 2 years, possessed a delicate beauty that made men stumble over their words and women narrow their eyes in jealousy. They were everything I wasn't, everything I could never be. And they made certain I knew it. "Why do you even bother leaving your room?" Eleanor would ask, her voice dripping with false concern whenever we passed in the hallways. "It's not as if anyone wants to see you." Vivienne was more creative in her cruelty. She would leave mirrors in my room, positioned so I would catch my veiled reflection unexpectedly. She would sigh dramatically and say, "I do hope whatever affliction you have isn't contagious. Mother worries so." I learned to swallow the pain, to let it settle in my stomach like stones. I learned that tears were a luxury I couldn't afford because they would only prove that I cared, that their words could still wound me. So I became stone myself, cold and silent, waiting for nothing, because hope was a torture I'd abandoned long ago. But there were moments, rare and precious, when I would steal away to the library that no one in the household used anymore. It had been my mother's favourite room, Martha had told me, filled with books in languages from distant lands. I taught myself to read there, slowly and painfully, by candlelight, devouring stories of places where girls like me might be heroes instead of burdens. The books became my escape, my companions, my proof that somewhere beyond these walls, a different kind of life existed. The night everything began to fracture, I was forced to accompany the procession. Not as a guest, but as a servile shadow. There would be a banquet in honor of the king, the alpha whom everyone spoke of in tones that mixed reverence and fear. I'd heard whispers about him for weeks. They said his mere presence silenced crowds, that his gaze pierced through lies, that no one dared stand upright before him without feeling the weight of his authority. They said he was searching for a companion, though no one seemed to know what that truly meant. Some claimed he sought a political alliance, others whispered darker purposes, and a few brave souls suggested he was simply lonely, though that seemed impossible for a man whose power was absolute. My heart pounded violently as we crossed through the illuminated gates of the palace. The building itself seemed to breathe power, its stone walls rising toward a sky scattered with stars that looked like distant, cold eyes. I wondered if I would be invisible to his eyes as well, or if he would be capable of seeing what I tried so hard to hide. My stepmother had insisted I come, though not out of any kindness. "The king has requested that all households present their members," she'd said, her lips curling in disgust. "Unfortunately, that includes you. But you will stay in the shadows. You will not speak. You will not draw attention to yourself. If you embarrass this family, I will make certain you regret the day you were born." As if I didn't already regret it with every breath. The ballroom was a cavern of golden light and crystalline laughter. Ladies displayed their heavy, jewel-laden gowns, men spoke of conquests and lineages, and the air was thick with sweet perfumes that made my head spin. I felt the stairs like barbs when I entered with the veil covering half my face. Murmurs were born immediately, like serpents coiling around one another. "It's her," I heard. "The hidden bastard." I pressed my fingers against the fabric, wishing I could become a wall, wishing I could become wind. And then, the air changed. It wasn't a sound, wasn't a gesture, it was simply his entrance. The king. The alpha. His presence made the murmur cease in fractions of a second, as if everyone had forgotten how to breathe. He wasn't beautiful in the frivolous sense that ladies dreamed of. There was something larger in him, more dangerous. His eyes, deep and of a shade I didn't dare name, swept across the ballroom with the calm of someone who knows nothing escapes him. His voice, when he spoke in greeting, echoed deep and resonant, filling every space, every void. I felt as if the ground trembled beneath my fragile feet. No one dared deny him reverence. Women bowed their heads, men held their breath. He moved through the crowd like a storm, dark and inevitable, and I couldn't look away even though every instinct screamed at me to hide further into the shadows. He wore black, unadorned except for a silver chain that caught the candlelight, and his presence made every other man in the room seem like a pale imitation of masculinity. Power radiated from him, not the kind bought with gold or inherited through blood, but the kind earned through strength and will and something more primal that I couldn't name. But in one moment, and I swear it wasn't imagination, his gaze found mine, brief but absolute, as if he had torn through the veil, as if he had seen through the fabric and the shame. That instant was a fire inside me, burning away the ice my stepmother had cultivated in my heart. I looked away immediately, my entire body trembling, but it was too late. Something had happened. Something had shifted in the air between us, and I felt it like a hook lodged in my chest, pulling, claiming. Hours dragged on. The banquet proceeded, laughter returned to fill the hall, and I remained in my corner, trying to be invisible, until my stepmother's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Your Majesty, permit me to present my daughters." She pushed them forward, dressed in vivid colours, glittering like jewels. Eleanor in crimson silk that clung to every curve, Vivian in emerald green that made her eyes shine like precious stones. "They are flowers from my garden worthy of any gaze." The court laughed, praised, extolled. I in the shadows clutched the locket hidden beneath my dress. And then, as if it were the caprice of gods or the irony of fate, I heard his question. "And who is the young woman with the veil?" The silence was immediate. The entire ballroom turned, as if only then remembering my presence. I felt my heart stop. My stepmother, with a smile that didn't hide the poison, answered, "A mistake, Your Majesty. Nothing worthy of note. A defective child that fate imposed upon me." The words fell like stones. The contained laughter echoed. I felt heat rising to my hidden face, and for a second I wished to disappear forever. But before shame could consume me completely, he stood. His shadow crossed the ballroom like a tide. He approached. Each step he took made the air denser. Each gaze that turned away from him was proof that no one dared oppose him. When he stopped before me, I raised my eyes just enough to see him. There was something in his expression that wasn't pity nor simple curiosity. It was as if a decision had already been made before I even existed there. His voice, when it came, left no room for contest. "Don't hide. I want to see the face of the one who dares to carry silence among so much noise." His hand didn't touch me, but the gesture of ordering the veil removed was more devastating than any physical contact could be. The ladies gasped, my stepmother paled, whispers exploded like a storm. And I, vulnerable, with my skin exposed to judgment, simply closed my eyes. I waited for the laughter. I waited for the disgust. I waited for confirmation that every horrible thing I'd been told about myself was true. But what came was worse than mockery. It was silence. Heavy, evaluating silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity. I could feel every eye on me, dissecting, analysing, searching for the monstrous defect I'd been told I carried. And then I heard it. A small, shocked breath from someone nearby. Not of horror, but of confusion. When I finally dared to open my eyes, I saw the king's expression, and it was nothing like what I'd expected. There was no revulsion there, no disappointment. Instead, there was something intense and unreadable, a recognition that made no sense. "Your Majesty," my stepmother's voice was strained, desperate. "As you can see, the girl is unsuitable for polite company. Perhaps we should—" "I see a young woman," he interrupted, his voice cutting through her words like steel through silk, "who has been deliberately hidden and maligned. I see someone who has survived cruelty with dignity and tact. I see exactly what I've been searching for." The ballroom erupted in whispers. My stepsister's faces twisted in fury and disbelief. Eleanor's perfect composure cracked, her mouth falling open in an expression of pure shock. Vivian actually took a step backward as if I'd suddenly become dangerous. But the king's eyes never left mine. They held me there, pinned and breathless, as he spoke words that would change everything. "I want you as my companion." The world seemed to crumble. The court rose in exclamations, my stepmother staggered, my stepsisters bit their lips in fury. I, incapable of moving a muscle, could only feel the weight of the sentence. It wasn't a request, it was a decree. And in that instant, I understood that my life, marked by hiding places and shadows, would never be the same again. For the most feared man in the kingdom had chosen precisely the cursed one, the unworthy one, the invisible one. And now everyone would have to look at me. But in his eyes, in that gaze that pierced through me, there was something beyond power. There was a mystery I didn't yet dare decipher, a destiny that was dragging me forward with no return. The king extended his hand toward me, and the gesture was more command than invitation. Around us, the ballroom had dissolved into chaos, voices rising and falling like waves, but I heard none of it. There was only his hand, steady and waiting. And the impossible choice before me, to remain in the shadows I knew, or step into a light that might burn me alive. "Come," he said. And though his voice was quiet, it carried absolute authority. "Unless you wish to stay here in this house of vipers." I looked at my stepmother. Her face had gone from pale to purple with rage, her carefully constructed mask of civility shattered completely. Eleanor and Vivian stood frozen, their beauty suddenly seeming cheap and artificial next to the raw power emanating from the man before me. In that moment, I saw them clearly for what they were, gilded cages that had never known what it meant to be truly free. My hand trembled as I raised it. When my fingers touched his, a shock ran through me, electric and terrifying and exhilarating all at once. His hand was warm, calloused from swordwork, and it closed around mine with a gentleness that seemed impossible for someone so fearsome. He led me through the crowd, which parted before us like water before a ship's bow. I felt their stares like brands on my skin, heard their whispered speculations, their shock and envy and confusion. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to disappear. The king's presence beside me was a shield and a proclamation all at once. "She is mine, and you will show her the respect you've denied her." We stopped at the head of the hall, where a throne sat on a raised dais. He turned to face the assembly, and his voice rang out clear and unyielding. "Let it be known throughout the kingdom that I have chosen my companion. She will be accorded every honor, every protection, every privilege that is my right to bestow. Any who question this decision questions me directly, and we all know how I deal with those who challenge my authority." The threat in his words was subtle but unmistakable. The crowd murmured their assent, bowing and curtsying, though I could see the resentment in some faces, the bewilderment in others. My stepmother looked as if she might faint. Her dreams of seeing one of her daughters crowned suddenly turned to ash. "Gather your belongings," the king said to me, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "You won't be returning to that house tonight, or ever, unless you choose to." "I have no belongings," I whispered. "Nothing but the clothes on my back and a locket." Something flickered in his eyes then, an emotion I couldn't name. "Then you have everything you need," he said. "The rest we'll provide." A woman appeared at his gesture, older and dignified, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she looked at me. "This is Lady Margaret," the king said. "She manages my household. She'll see to your comfort and needs. Trust her as you would trust me." Lady Margaret curtsied to me, actually curtsied, as if I was someone worthy of respect. "Come, dear," she said gently. "Let's get you settled. I imagine tonight has been overwhelming." Overwhelming didn't begin to cover it. I felt as if I'd been picked up by a storm and deposited in a completely foreign land where the rules I'd learned no longer applied, where I wasn't the one who needed to hide, to apologize for existing, to make myself small and forgettable. As Lady Margaret led me away, I glanced back once. The king stood watching me, his expression unreadable but intense. Behind him, my stepmother and stepsisters clustered together, their faces masks of fury and disbelief. For a moment our eyes met across the distance, Eleanor's and mine, and I saw in her gaze what I'd never seen before. Fear. She was afraid of me now, afraid of what I might become, what I might do with the power that had just been placed in my hands. The thought should have brought me satisfaction. Instead, I felt only a strange emptiness, as if I'd been carrying hatred for so long that without it I didn't know what to feel. Lady Margaret brought me to a suite of rooms that took my breath away. Silk hangings in deep blue covered the walls, Plush carpets softened my footsteps, and a fire crackled merrily in an enormous hearth. A bed, larger than any I'd ever seen, dominated one wall, piled high with pillows and blankets that looked softer than clouds. "These are your chambers," Lady Margaret said. "You'll find clothing in the wardrobe already prepared." The king sent word ahead to have everything made ready. He's been expecting someone for quite some time, though I don't think even he knew exactly who he was searching for until tonight. "I don't understand," I said, my voice small in the grand space. "Why me? What does he want from me?" Lady Margaret smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "That's a question only he can answer, dear. But I've served him for many years, and I can tell you this, he isn't a man who acts on whim. If he chose you, it's because he saw something in you that he needed. Something real and true, not the painted faces and false smiles that usually surround him." She helped me out of my worn dress and into a nightgown so soft it felt like wearing water. When she moved to take down my hair, I flinched instinctively, expecting pain, expecting cruelty. But her hands were gentle, working out the tangles with patient care. "Sleep now," she said when I was tucked into the massive bed. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, but tonight, you're safe. No one can hurt you here." But as I lay in that comfortable bed in those luxurious rooms, surrounded by more wealth and comfort than I'd ever known, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with questions and fears. What did the king really want from me? What did it mean to be his companion? And most terrifying of all, what happened when he discovered that underneath the veil there was just a girl, ordinary and unremarkable, with no special gifts or qualities to justify his choice? I clutched my mother's locket, the only familiar thing in this strange new world, and tried to imagine what she would have told me if she were here. Would she have warned me to run, to refuse this gilded cage that might be just as imprisoning as my stepmother's house? Or would she have encouraged me to be brave, to seize this chance for something different even if it terrified me? The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and eventually exhaustion claimed me. But my dreams were troubled, filled with images of veils being torn away and faces that shifted and changed, unable to settle on any one form. And through it all, a pair of dark, penetrating eyes that saw everything, judged everything, knew everything about me that I'd tried so desperately to hide. I woke to sunlight streaming through windows I hadn't noticed the night before, and for a disorienting moment I couldn't remember where I was. Then memory crashed back, and with it came a wave of anxiety so intense it nearly made me sick. This was real. All of it was real. The king had chosen me, claimed me in front of everyone, and now I was here, in his palace, expected to be something I had no idea how to be. A knock at the door made me jump. Lady Margaret entered, followed by several young women carrying trays of food and armfuls of clothing. "Good morning, dear," she said cheerfully. "I trust you slept well? We've brought breakfast, and we need to prepare you. The king has requested your presence at midday." My stomach clenched. What does he want? To speak with you, I imagine. To begin to know you properly. This is all rather unusual, you understand. Normally there would be a courtship period, negotiations, formalities, but the king has never been one for following convention when it doesn't suit him. The young women helped me bathe in a copper tub, filled with steaming water scented with lavender. They washed my hair, which hadn't been properly cleaned in longer than I could remember, and when they were done, I barely recognized myself in the mirror they held up. Without the grime and neglect, my hair shone dark and glossy. My skin, which I'd been told was marked and ugly, looked smooth and unblemished. My eyes, which I'd been told resembled a wounded animal's, were simply eyes, large and expressive and, I had to admit, rather striking in their unusual color. "There's nothing wrong with you," one of the young women said softly, meeting my gaze in the mirror. "There never was there? They just told you there was." The realization hit me like a physical blow. All those years, all that shame and hiding, and it had been a lie. My stepmother had hidden me not because I was defective, but because I wasn't. Because I might have been competition for her daughters. Because I was a reminder of my father's first love. Because cruelty was simply her nature and I was a convenient target. Rage bloomed in my chest, hot and righteous, but beneath it was something else. Something more fragile, the dawning understanding that I had no idea who I actually was. I'd spent so long believing I was something hideous and shameful that I'd never bothered to look deeper, to discover what lay beneath the lies I'd been fed. They dressed me in a gown of deep green that brought out the colour of my eyes. It was simpler than Eleanor's or Vivian's elaborate confections, but it fit perfectly, hugging my figure in ways that made me feel feminine and powerful all at once. They arranged my hair in loose waves down my back, and when they were finished, I looked like someone else entirely, someone who might actually belong in a palace. Lady Margaret led me through corridors that seemed to stretch on forever, past paintings of stern-faced ancestors and windows that looked out over gardens so beautiful they seemed painted rather than real. Servants bowed as we passed, and I had to resist the urge to apologize for taking up space, for breathing their air. We stopped before a set of massive oak doors. Lady Margaret squeezed my hand once, encouragingly, then pushed them open. The king stood by a window, his back to us, silhouetted against the morning light. When he turned, I felt that same shock I'd experienced the night before. That sense of encountering something too large, too powerful, too fundamentally other to fully comprehend. "Leave us," he said to Lady Margaret, who curtsied and withdrew, closing the doors behind her. We were alone. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken questions. I wanted to look away, but found I couldn't. His eyes held mine with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable, as if he were reading my soul and finding it wanting. "Do you know why I chose you?" he asked finally. I shook my head, not trusting my voice. "Because you're the only person in that entire ballroom who wasn't performing," he said. "Everyone else was playing a role, wearing a mask, trying to be what they thought I wanted to see. But you, hiding in the shadows with your veil, you were simply being. Honest in your fear, honest in your shame, honest in your desire to disappear. And honesty, I've learned, is the rarest commodity in this world." "But I'm nobody," I whispered. "I'm nothing special. When you discover that, when you realize you've made a mistake—" "I don't make mistakes," he interrupted, and there was no arrogance in the statement, only certainty. "I've lived long enough and seen enough to trust my instincts, and every instinct I have is telling me that you're exactly what I need." "For what?" The question burst out of me, frustration and confusion making me bold. "What do you need me for? What does it mean to be your companion? What do you want from me?" He moved then, crossing the distance between us in a few long strides. He stopped just close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him, smell the scent of leather and smoke that clung to his skin. Close enough to be overwhelming without actually touching. "What I want," he said slowly, "is someone who isn't afraid to question me. Someone who will tell me the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Someone who has survived cruelty without becoming cruel herself. I want a partner, not a pretty ornament. An equal, not a subject. And yes, I realize how insane that sounds given the circumstances of last night, given that I essentially commanded you to be mine. But I'm hoping in time you'll choose to stay, not because you have to, but because you want to." "And if I don't?" I asked, though my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. "If I find I can't be what you need, what then?" "Then you'll be free to go," he said simply. "I won't force you, won't trap you. But I'm asking you to give this a chance. Give me a chance. Give yourself a chance to discover who you are when you're not being crushed under someone else's lies and expectations." I looked up at him, this powerful, frightening, impossibly intense man who seemed to see through every defense I'd ever built. And I realized that I wanted to say yes. Not because I understood what was happening, not because I wasn't terrified, but because for the first time in my life, someone was offering me a choice. A real choice, with no hidden strings or ulterior motives that I could detect. "I'll try," I said. "I can't promise anything more than that, but I'll try." Something shifted in his expression, a softening that made him seem suddenly more human, more approachable. "That's all I ask," he said. And then, unexpectedly, he smiled. It transformed his face, erasing the hardness and revealing something warm and almost playful underneath. "Now, shall we have breakfast? I find these dramatic conversations go much better with food." And just like that, the tension broke. I found myself smiling back, a real smile that felt strange on my face because it had been so long since I'd had reason to use one. He led me to a small dining room, far more intimate than the grand ballroom from the night before. A table was set with more food than I'd seen in a month. Fresh bread, honey, preserves, sliced fruits, cheeses, meats. My stomach growled embarrassingly loud and he laughed. "Please eat," he said. "You look like you haven't had a proper meal in years." He wasn't wrong. Under my stepmother's rule, I'd been given scraps, leftovers, whatever couldn't be used or didn't look presentable enough for the family table. I ate slowly at first, conscious of manners I'd never been properly taught, but the king seemed unconcerned with formality. He ate with the efficient practicality of a soldier, and gradually I relaxed enough to actually enjoy the food. "Tell me about yourself," he said between bites. "I know what others have said about you, but I want to hear your story in your own words." So I told him, haltingly at first, then with increasing confidence as he listened without judgment or interruption. I told him about my mother's death, my father's remarriage and subsequent withdrawal. I told him about my stepmother's cruelty, my stepsister's taunts, the years of isolation and shame. I told him about the veil, about being hidden away like something shameful, about believing I was truly as monstrous as they claimed. When I finished, his expression was dark with anger, though I sensed it wasn't directed at me. "They broke every law of hospitality and kinship," he said quietly. "They took a vulnerable child and systematically destroyed her sense of self-worth. That kind of cruelty isn't casual, it's calculated. And it will be answered for." "What do you mean?" I asked, alarm rising. "You're not going to hurt them, are you?" "I don't want peace," he said, raising a hand. "I won't harm them physically, but they will face consequences. Your stepmother will find that her social standing has suddenly become precarious. Your stepsisters will discover that their prospects for advantageous marriages have mysteriously dried up. And your father, weak and cowardly though he may be, will have to live with the knowledge that he failed in the most fundamental duty a parent has, to protect his child." The satisfaction in his voice should have disturbed me, but instead I felt a fierce gladness. They would suffer, not through violence, but through the loss of everything they'd valued above my well-being. It seemed fitting. "Now," he said, changing the subject, "tell me what you want. Not what you think I want to hear, not what you've been told to want, but what you actually desire for yourself." The question stunned me. No one had ever asked me that before. I'd spent so long just trying to survive, to endure, that I'd never allowed myself to imagine anything beyond escape from immediate suffering. "I don't know," I admitted. "I've never thought about it." "Then start thinking about it now," he said. "You have time. You have safety. You have resources. What would you do if you could do anything?" I considered letting myself imagine possibilities I'd never dared entertain before. "I'd like to learn things," I said slowly. "To read properly. Not just the few words I taught myself in secret. To understand music and art and history. To know about the world beyond the walls I've been trapped inside. I'd like to be useful, to have skills and knowledge that matter. And I'd like..." I hesitated, feeling foolish. "Go on," he encouraged. "I'd like to be seen," I whispered. Really seen, not as an embarrassment or a burden or a possession, but as a person, as someone who matters. He reached across the table and took my hand, and the touch sent electricity up my arm. "You are seen," he said intensely, "by me, and you matter. Never doubt that." The weeks that followed were strange and disorienting and wonderful in ways I struggled to articulate. The king, whose name I learned was Alexander, though only in private, proved to be far more complex than his fearsome reputation suggested. Yes, he was powerful and commanding, capable of silencing a room with a single look. But he was also patient, surprisingly gentle when he chose to be, and possessed of a dry humor that caught me off guard every time. He kept his promise about letting me learn. Tutors appeared, kind and knowledgeable people who taught me to read fluently, to write in an elegant hand, to understand mathematics and history, and the natural sciences. I discovered that I had a quick mind when it wasn't being actively suppressed, that I could absorb information and make connections that impressed even my teachers. My language tutor, an elderly scholar named Professor Whitmore, was particularly encouraging. "You have a gift for languages, my dear," he said one afternoon after I'd successfully translated a complex passage from an ancient text. "Your mind grasps patterns intuitively. With proper training, you could become fluent, in half a dozen tongues. The praise made me uncomfortable at first. I was so used to being told I was worthless that compliments felt like traps, like things that would be snatched away the moment I believed them. But Professor Whitmore was patient, repeatedly reinforcing that my abilities were real, that I had value beyond what others had tried to convince me. Alexander watched my progress with evident satisfaction. Sometimes he would join my lessons, engaging in debates about philosophy or history that left me breathless and laughing and feeling more alive than I ever had before. He challenged me, pushed me to think deeper and question everything, and I found myself rising to meet him one evening. After a particularly stimulating discussion about the nature of justice and mercy in governance, Alexander walked with me through the palace gardens. The air was cool and scented with night-blooming jasmine, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly at peace. "You're thriving," he said, and there was wonder in his voice. "Every day you become more yourself, more confident. It's extraordinary to witness." "I'm still afraid," I admitted. "Every morning I wake up and think this must be a dream, that I'll blink and find myself back in that cold room with the veil and the shame." He stopped walking and turned to face me fully. "That life is over," he said firmly. "You will never go back to being that frightened girl in the shadows. Even if you left here tomorrow, even if you chose a different path, you could never be who you were before. You've tasted freedom, tasted your own power. That can't be taken from you now." His words settled something in me, a truth I'd been afraid to acknowledge. He was right. I had changed fundamentally and irrevocably. The question was no longer whether I could survive, but who I would choose to become. But there were complications. The court had accepted his decree, but that didn't mean they were happy about it. I could feel their resentment, their confusion about why he'd chosen someone like me. Ladies who'd spent years positioning themselves or their daughters for his attention now looked at me with barely concealed hatred. Men who'd thought they understood the hierarchy of power suddenly found themselves uncertain, wondering what influence I might wield over the king. Lady Helena, one of the most prominent nobles at court, made her displeasure particularly clear. She had a daughter, Clarissa, who'd been considered a prime candidate for Alexander's hand. Beautiful, accomplished, perfectly bred for the role of queen. Clarissa had been groomed from birth to take that position. The first time I encountered Lady Helena in the palace corridors, she looked at me as if I was something unpleasant she'd stepped in. "So you're the king's little project?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "How charming. I do hope you don't embarrass him too badly at the state dinner next week. It would be such a shame if his momentary lapse in judgment became a permanent source of ridicule." The words stung, hitting too close to my own fears. But before I could respond, Lady Margaret appeared, her expression fierce despite her usually gentle demeanour. "Lady Helena," she said coldly, "I suggest you remember who you're speaking to. This young woman is under the king's personal protection and is to be treated with the respect due to her position. Any disrespect shown to her will be considered disrespect to the king himself. I trust I've made myself clear." Lady Helena paled slightly but recovered quickly. "Of course," she said tightly. "I meant no offence. I was simply offering friendly advice." As she swept away, I turned to Lady Margaret gratefully. "Thank you," I said. "But you didn't have to do that. I need to learn to handle people like her on my own." "You will," Lady Margaret assured me. "But there's no shame in accepting help while you're learning. That woman is a viper and she's dangerous because she has influence. Be careful around her and her circle. They see you as a threat to everything they've planned and worked for." The warning proved prescient. Over the following weeks, I began to notice a pattern. Invitations to tea that never arrived, conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered a room, subtle slights and exclusions designed to remind me that I didn't belong. It was psychological warfare, conducted with smiles and polite words that carried poisoned edges. But I refused to let them break me. I'd survived far worse than social exclusion. And I had something they didn't: Alexander's genuine regard, which couldn't be faked or manipulated. When he asked my opinion in council meetings, when he sought my company for evening walks, when he looked at me with that intensity that made my heart race, I knew it was real. I tried to stay out of court politics, to focus on my studies and on learning how to navigate this new world. But Alexander had other plans. He began bringing me to meetings, asking my opinion on matters of state, making it clear that I wasn't just a companion in name, but in practice. The first time he asked me what I thought about a trade dispute, I'd frozen, certain it was some kind of test I would fail. "I don't know anything about trade," I'd said. "So learn," he'd replied. "You have access to all the information you need. Study the issue and tell me your thoughts tomorrow." I'd stayed up half the night reading documents about tariffs and merchant guilds and economic theory, my head spinning with new concepts. But when I'd presented my analysis the next day, hesitant and sure, I'd gotten everything wrong. He'd smiled and implemented several of my suggestions. "You see patterns," he'd explained later. "You're not constrained by the way things have always been done. Fresh eyes see things that those of us mired in tradition miss. Your outsider perspective is valuable, not a weakness." The validation was intoxicating. For the first time in my life, my thoughts mattered. People listened when I spoke, not out of obligation, but because I had something worth saying. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Lady Margaret became not just a guide, but a friend. She taught me the subtle language of court, how to read a room, how to deflect insults without giving offense, how to navigate the treacherous waters of noble politics. She also told me stories about Alexander, about the man behind the fearsome reputation. "He wasn't always this hard," she said one afternoon as we walked through the gardens. "When he first took the throne, he was younger, more idealistic. He thought people would respond to fairness and justice, but he learned that kindness was often mistaken for weakness, that some people will only respect power backed by the threat of consequences. So he became what he needed to be to survive and to protect the kingdom. But inside, the man who wanted to build something better is still there. I think you remind him of who he was before the world beat the softness out of him." The thought made my chest ache. I was beginning to understand Alexander in ways that went beyond gratitude or obligation. When he smiled at something clever, I said, I felt warm all over. When his hand brushed mine in passing, my skin tingled for hours afterward. When he looked at me with that intense focus that made me feel like the only person in the world, my heart raced in a way that both thrilled and terrified me. I was falling in love with him. Or maybe I'd been falling from the moment he'd looked at me in that ballroom and seen something worth claiming. The realization was both exhilarating and frightening, because loving someone this powerful, this complicated, this fundamentally unknowable seemed like inviting heartbreak. But I couldn't stop myself. Every conversation, every shared laugh, every moment of comfortable silence drew me deeper. And sometimes when I caught him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, I dared to hope that maybe, possibly, he might be falling too. The state dinner Lady Helena had mentioned arrived too quickly. It would be my first major public appearance as Alexander's companion, and the court would be watching, judging, waiting for me to fail. Alexander sensed my nervousness and pulled me aside before we entered the grand hall. "You'll be magnificent," he said, his hands on my shoulders, warm and grounding. "Remember, you're not that frightened girl anymore. You're someone who has survived impossible odds and emerged stronger. Let them see who you've become." The dinner was a trial by fire. I was seated at Alexander's right hand, the position of honor, which only emphasized how irregular my presence was. Throughout the meal, I felt eyes on me, assessing, critiquing. Lady Helena's daughter Clarissa sat nearby, beautiful and poised, everything I wasn't. She smiled sweetly at me, but her eyes were cold. "It must be so overwhelming," she said during a lull in conversation, her voice carrying to nearby guests. "Going from such humble circumstances to all this grandeur. I do hope you're managing. It would be terrible if the pressure became too much." It was a trap. If I admitted to struggling, I'd confirm their belief that I didn't belong. If I claimed confidence, I'd seem arrogant and ungrateful. But before I could formulate a response, Alexander's voice cut through the tension. "Actually," he said smoothly, "she's managing far better than most who were born to this life. Intelligence and adaptability matter far more than breeding, as I'm sure you'll agree, Lady Clarissa. After all, anyone can be taught to hold a fork correctly. But wisdom, true wisdom, can't be inherited." The rebuke was subtle but unmistakable. Clarissa's smile faltered, and Lady Helena looked like she'd swallowed something sour. Around us, other guests suddenly found their plates fascinating. Alexander had made it clear. Attacks on me would be treated as attacks on him, and that was a line no one wanted to cross. Later, as we danced, Alexander pulled me close. "You handled that well," he murmured. "You didn't panic, didn't lash out. You were about to respond with dignity and grace. I'm proud of you." "You didn't have to defend me," I said, though warmth bloomed in my chest at his words. "I know," he said, "but I wanted to. And more importantly, I wanted them to understand that you're under my protection. They can resent it all they want, but they will respect it." As we moved across the floor, I realized something important. This wasn't just about Alexander protecting me. It was about him standing beside me, showing the world that he'd chosen me not out of pity or whim, but because he valued me, because he believed I deserved to be there. And slowly, painfully, I was beginning to believe it too. 3 months after that fateful night, word came that my father had died. The news was delivered by a messenger who seemed unsure whether I would care. I'd found to my surprise that I did care, though not in the way I would have expected. I mourned not for the man who'd abandoned me, but for the father he could have been, should have been, if he'd had the courage to stand up for me. Alexander found me in the gardens, where I'd retreated to process the news. He said nothing at first, just sat beside me on the stone bench and waited. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady. "I think I forgive him," I said. "Not because he deserves it, but because carrying the anger was exhausting. I'm tired of letting the past define me." "That's wise," Alexander said quietly, "and braver than you know." "My stepmother sent a letter," I continued. "She wants me to attend the funeral. She says it would be proper that despite our differences, family is family. Do you want to go?" I considered. Part of me wanted to refuse, to cut all ties and never look back. But another part, the part that was learning to be strong rather than just surviving, wanted to face them one more time. Not as the hidden, shameful burden, but as the woman I was becoming. "Yes," I said. "I want to go. Will you come with me?" His answer was immediate. "Of course." The funeral was held at the house where I'd spent so many miserable years. Returning there with Alexander at my side was surreal. The servants gaped. The few family members who'd gathered whispered behind their hands, and my stepmother looked as if she'd aged a decade. Eleanor and Vivian were there, dressed in appropriately somber clothes. But their eyes, when they looked at me, held pure venom. Through it all, Alexander remained close, a solid presence that reminded me I was no longer vulnerable, no longer alone. When my stepmother tried to speak to me, tried to take my hand with false sympathy, he'd stepped slightly forward. And whatever she saw in his face made her shrink back. After the ceremony, as we prepared to leave, Eleanor cornered me in a hallway. "You think you've won!" she hissed, her beautiful face twisted with rage. "You think because the king has some inexplicable fascination with you that you're better than us now. But we both know the truth. You're still the same pathetic creature you always were, just dressed in better clothes." For a moment, I felt the old shame trying to resurface, the voice that insisted she was right, that I was an imposter who didn't deserve this life. But then I looked at her, really looked, and saw not the elegant beauty who'd tormented me for years, but a frightened woman who'd built her entire identity on being superior to someone she deemed less than. And I felt something I'd never expected to feel. Pity. "You're right," I said softly. "In some ways, I am the same person. I still doubt myself, still question whether I'm worthy of what I've been given. But the difference between us, Eleanor, is that I'm learning and growing and becoming more each day. While you're trapped, frozen in amber, unable to imagine any value beyond your appearance and your ability to make others feel small. And honestly, I think that's sadder than anything you ever did to me." I walked away, leaving her sputtering behind me. Alexander was waiting by the carriage, and when he saw my face, he smiled. "Well?" he asked. "It's done," I said. "I don't need to come back here ever again." The ride back to the palace was quiet, but it was a comfortable quiet. I looked out the window at the countryside passing by and felt something settle in my chest. I'd faced my past, acknowledged it without letting it define me, and come out stronger. Whatever happened next, I was ready for it. "I need to tell you something," Alexander said as we neared the palace. His voice was serious, almost hesitant, and that caught my attention immediately. "What is it?" The reason I was looking for a companion. The reason I chose you so publicly and dramatically isn't just about personal compatibility or even about having someone to share my life with, though I do want those things." He paused, seeming to struggle with his words, which was unusual for him. "There are expectations attached to my position. The council has been pressuring me for years to take a wife, to produce an heir, to secure the succession. I've resisted because I refuse to treat marriage as a political transaction, to bind myself to someone for the sake of alliance or bloodline." My heart was pounding. And when I saw you that night hiding in the shadows, carrying dignity in the face of cruelty, I knew you were someone I could actually love, not just tolerate. Someone real and honest and brave in ways that matter. But I also knew that by claiming you publicly, I was essentially forcing your hand, giving you no real choice in the matter. And that's been eating at me. He turned to face me fully, taking both my hands in his. "So I'm asking you now, with no pressure, no obligation, no expectations. I'm asking if you would consider, in time, when you're ready, becoming not just my companion but my wife, my partner in all things. I'm not asking for an answer now. I just needed you to know that this is what I'm hoping for, what I want if you want it too." I stared at him. This powerful man who ruled a kingdom with absolute authority, asking rather than commanding, offering rather than demanding. And I realized that at some point in the last few months, the answer had become obvious. "I don't need time," I said. "Yes, my answer is yes." The joy that lit his face was like nothing I'd ever seen before. He pulled me into his arms and for the first time we kissed. It was gentle and fierce all at once, a claiming and a surrender, a promise of everything we would become together. When we finally pulled apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against mine. "No, you've saved me," he whispered, "from becoming something cold and bitter, from forgetting what it means to hope." "And you've saved me," I replied, "from disappearing completely, from never knowing who I could be." The engagement was announced the following week, and the court erupted in controlled chaos. Some nobles were genuinely pleased, seeing in our union a romantic story that gave them hope. Others were furious, their carefully laid plans destroyed by Alexander's choice. But no one dared oppose it openly, not when Alexander made it clear that any disrespect toward me would be met with swift consequences. The wedding preparations took 3 months. Lady Margaret orchestrated everything with military precision, ensuring that every detail was perfect. She became more than a guide during those months. She became the mother figure I'd never had, fussing over fabric choices and guest lists with genuine affection. "You're going to be a wonderful queen," she said one afternoon as seamstresses fitted my wedding gown. "Not because you're perfect, but because you understand what it means to suffer, to be powerless, to need help. That empathy will make you a better ruler than 100 women born to the title." I learned to accept compliments like that, to believe that perhaps they were true. The girl who'd hidden in shadows was still part of me, would always be part of me, but she no longer defined who I was. I'd become something more, something stronger, forged in the crucible of cruelty and tempered by love. Alexander and I spent every evening together, talking late into the night about everything and nothing. He told me about the weight of kingship, the loneliness of always having to be strong, never being able to show weakness or doubt. I told him about my dreams for the kingdom, about the programs I wanted to create for orphans and abandoned children, about using my position to ensure no child suffered as I had. "You're going to change everything," he said one night, his voice full of wonder. "Not through force or decree, but through compassion and action. You're going to make this kingdom better in ways I never could alone." The wedding was held on a perfect spring day, with flowers blooming throughout the palace gardens and sunshine streaming through the cathedral windows. I walked down the aisle in a dress of white silk and lace, my face unveiled and proud, meeting Alexander's gaze with confidence and love. My stepmother and stepsisters were in attendance because I'd insisted they be invited, not to gloat, but to show them that their cruelty hadn't destroyed me, that I'd survived and thrived despite their best efforts to break me. Lady Margaret cried happy tears. The servants who'd been kind to me in my darkest days watched with visible pride. Professor Whitmore beamed from his seat, proud of his star pupil. And Alexander, standing at the altar waiting for me, looked at me as if I were the most precious thing in his world. The vows we spoke were traditional, but the promises beneath them were ours alone. To see each other truly, to challenge and support in equal measure, to build something together that was stronger than either of us could create alone. When the ceremony ended and we were proclaimed husband and wife, King and Queen, the cheers that rose from the crowd were genuine, because people could see what we had, could feel the authenticity of what we'd built. At the reception, as Alexander and I danced for the first time as husband and wife, I caught sight of Eleanor and Vivian standing at the edge of the crowd. They looked diminished somehow, their beauty seeming hollow next to the genuine joy that filled the room. For a moment our eyes met and I saw something I'd never seen before: regret. Not for how they'd treated me, but for what they'd lost by being so consumed with cruelty that they'd never learned to build anything real. "What are you thinking?" Alexander asked, following my gaze. "That I forgive them," I said. Not because they deserve it, but because I refuse to let their hatred have any more power over me. They're part of my story, but they don't get to write the ending. He kissed my forehead gently. "That's the difference between strength and power," he said. "Power is the ability to hurt others. Strength is the ability to survive hurt and still choose kindness. You're the strongest person I know." The years that followed were not without challenges. Ruling a kingdom is never easy, and there were those who questioned my fitness, my background, my right to stand beside Alexander. Lady Helena and her circle continued their subtle warfare for years, though they were careful never to cross lines that would bring Alexander's wrath down upon them. But we faced every obstacle together, and gradually even the doubters came to respect, if not like me. I used my position to create programs for orphans and abandoned children, establishing schools and shelters throughout the kingdom. I worked with scholars to improve education for all children, regardless of birth or status. I created safe houses for those fleeing abuse, remembering what it felt like to be trapped with no escape. Alexander stood beside me in all of it, proud of what I was accomplishing, never once trying to diminish or control what I did. We ruled together, truly as partners, and the kingdom flourished under our combined leadership. We had our disagreements, our arguments, because we were both strong-willed and passionate, but we always came back to each other, always remembered what we'd promised. There were moments of genuine joy that surprised me with their intensity. The first time a child from one of my orphanages hugged me and called me their hero, I cried for an hour. When Alexander surprised me with a complete library in the palace, filled with books from around the world, I felt like I might burst with happiness. When we danced alone in our chambers late at night, no audience but each other, I felt more at peace than I'd ever imagined possible. 5 years after our wedding, I gave birth to our first child, a daughter with her father's dark eyes and my determination. We named her Hope because that's what she represented, the future we were building, the possibility of something better. And when I held her in my arms looking into that tiny, perfect face, I made her a promise she would never be hidden, never be shamed, never be made to feel less than the miracle she was. Alexander was a devoted father, surprising everyone who thought kings should be distant and formal with their children. He would spend hours playing with Hope, reading to her, teaching her to be strong and kind and curious about the world. Watching him with our daughter, I fell in love with him all over again. 2 years later, we had a son, whom we named Thomas after Alexander's father. And 3 years after that, another daughter, Grace. Our family grew, and with it grew the love that filled our lives. Our children were raised to understand that privilege came with responsibility. That power should be used to help those who had less. That kindness was not weakness, but the greatest strength of all. Standing in the nursery one evening, watching Alexander hold our youngest while our other children played nearby, I thought about the girl I'd been. The one who'd hidden in shadows, who'd believed she was worthless, who'd never dared dream of anything beyond survival. If I could go back and tell her what was coming, she never would have believed me. But that's the thing about transformation. It happens not in a single moment, but in 1,000 small choices. The choice to accept Alexander's hand, the choice to learn and grow, the choice to forgive and let go, the choice to believe I deserved love and respect and a life that mattered. Each choice built on the last, creating a foundation strong enough to support the woman I'd become. I was no longer the hidden one, the shameful secret kept in the shadows. I was the queen, yes, but more than that, I was myself, fully and completely, without apology or explanation. And that was the greatest gift Alexander had given me. Not his crown or his protection, but the space and safety to discover who I truly was when no one was telling me I was worthless. As the sun set over the palace, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, I stood with my family and looked out over the kingdom we were building together. There would be more challenges ahead, more obstacles to overcome. But I was ready for them. We were ready for them, because I had learned the most important lesson of all. Your past doesn't have to define your future. The cruelty you've survived doesn't have to make you cruel. The shame others tried to force on you doesn't have to become your truth. You can choose differently. You can choose to grow, to heal, to become something stronger and better than what hurt you intended. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you'll find someone who sees you, truly sees you, and chooses to stand beside you while you become who you were always meant to be. On our 10th wedding anniversary, Alexander took me back to the ballroom where we'd first met. It had been transformed for a private celebration, with candles casting the same golden glow I remembered from that fateful night. But this time I wasn't hiding in the shadows. I was standing in the center of the room in the light with the man I loved by my side. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked him as we danced alone in the vast space. "Choosing someone like me instead of someone who was trained for this role from birth?" He pulled me closer, his hand warm on my back. "Never," he said firmly. "Not once, not for a single moment. You've given me everything I didn't know I needed. Honesty, compassion, purpose beyond mere power. You've made me a better man, a better king. Our children are growing up in a palace filled with love instead of political maneuvering. The kingdom is thriving in ways it never did when I ruled alone. How could I possibly regret the best decision I've ever made?" "I love you," I said, the words still feeling new and precious even after all these years. "And I love you," he replied. My hidden treasure who became my guiding light. We danced until the candles burned low, and in that ballroom where my life had changed forever, I felt the circle complete. The frightened girl in the veil had become a woman who changed a kingdom. The invisible one had become impossible to ignore. The unwanted had become irreplaceable. And through it all, the lesson remained the same. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to disappear, to insist on being seen, to believe that you deserve a place in the light, because you do. We all do. If you've been with me through this journey, if this story touched your heart or made you think about transformation and resilience, I invite you to like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment telling me what part resonated most with you and subscribe to join our community of storytellers and dreamers. Your support means everything and allows us to keep bringing these stories to life.